today we're going to learn about some of the current threats that are out there and what you can do to really help yourself protect your organization's sensitive data. And we're joined today by our CTO here at Application Security, Josh Shaul, and he's going to walk you through some of these steps that you can take to go ahead and protect your data in 2012. So at this point, I'm going to hand this over to Josh.
Thanks, Jeff, and thanks everyone for joining us today. Get started with a very brief review of some of the news we read in 2011. 2011 was really a stunning year as a data security professional sort of watched happen. There was just more massive breaches than we've ever seen in a 12-month period before. Really an unprecedented amount of data being dumped out onto the internet and being pulled out of corporate networks. And we saw not just the weak being knocked down, but we also saw the strong being knocked down. And when I say that, I mean organizations like RSA, one of the biggest and most significant information security companies in the industry, managed to get knocked down for some of their most sensitive data. This is really an incredible problem that we saw throughout the course of the year, with a real mix of hackers of different skill levels and different levels of dedication, just doing an astounding amount of damage to organizations. You know, we pick up most of this information by reading the news, just like everyone else does, and I know we've got our go-to media outlets that we read to pick up our news. But you know, you all folks on the call today could help us. Give us a little bit of feedback. We're really curious to know where you turn to for your security news. So throughout the webinar today, I'd appreciate it if you use the questions panel and just give us your thoughts about the different media outlets that you turn to, the forums that you read, to keep up to date on the latest happenings in the industry. It'd be a big help for us, and we'd really appreciate that feedback throughout the webinar today. Now, as I look forward at 2012, the first thing that comes to mind for me is that the hackers that have been so successful throughout 2011 are going to carry that momentum forward into 2012. And I like to bucket the hackers into three categories, and I know this is somewhat brutish to do it this way, but I think of those who are out there for data theft reasons, the folks who want to steal your information and use that information and want to sell it for profit. Then I look at the hacktivists out there, the groups like Anonymous and LulzSec, that are hacking to make noise. They're there to be a nuisance. They're there for a cause, but it's not for their own profit. And then the third category, probably the most difficult to deal with, are the hackers that are out there for espionage reasons. And I lump together both the folks that are out there for industrial espionage and the ones who are trying to steal government secrets from one another. These folks that are out, the attackers that are out there trying to do espionage tend to be the most highly skilled, the most well-funded, the most capable that are out there. These are the guys that are originating and creating the APTs that are successful at knocking over these big, strong security organizations like RSA. So I expect that momentum that the hackers built up in 2011 to continue to carry forward. And, you know, some of the reasons for that, well, particularly Anonymous, ran a hacker school throughout 2011. They actually recruited and trained folks to become new hacktivists. So there's a lot more skills that are out there in the open than have been in the past from a hacker perspective. And you can only expect that the people who invested time to learn hacking, well, they're gonna leverage that investment and actually use the skills that they obtained. We also expect that throughout 2012, databases are going to continue to be the primary target. And maybe it's pretty obvious. Databases are where we store the vast majority of the sensitive information that we hold. Databases hold more sensitive data than all other storage formats put together. So with this much sensitive data in databases, it makes sense that that's where the attackers are going to continue to target. That's where they're going to reap the big rewards. And part of the reason why they'll continue to target there is because the same old attack vectors are going to continue to be successful. I'm starting to stop asking the question, are we learning about SQL injection, and starting to wonder, maybe we just have to accept the fact that SQL injection is here to stay and that we're not going to fix it. And we're going to leave these holes in our applications that allow outsiders direct access to our databases. I fully expect to see SQL injection continue to be the number one or number two attack vector used in 2012. It's just so easy to be successful. At the same time, from the research side, we're starting to see some new attack techniques emerge around the database. And I'd be surprised if we don't see some of these get filled into the hackers' repertoire. Well, I've recently seen a whole new bout of attacks against Sybase databases, things that Sybase is working on patching but haven't been patched yet. I've seen some new Microsoft SQL Server attacks that again, are in the works to be fixed. But these are some new techniques that attackers can use to do things like remote and local file inclusion through the database, which can be accessed through SQL injection. So I'm starting to see this chaining of attack techniques mixed together with new vulnerabilities that are being uncovered to give attackers new ways at doing sort of old tricks. Finally, the costs associated with a data breach, I expect them to continue to rise. Those costs have gone up year after year. Ponemon does a great study. I'll talk a little bit about that as we continue on the cost of a data breach every year, but I fully expect that cost will go up, and I think a lot of the reason for that is an increased scrutiny from legislators on data breaches, particularly with the results of 2011 and the number of breaches and the amount of personal data that was accessed by attackers. I think the big risk that we face in 2012 is a focus-driven risk. And what I mean by that is that forever, it seems like organizations have focused their information security efforts on the perimeter and the endpoints. Folks have spent their time putting up firewalls, putting antivirus on the endpoints, and trying to update and maintain those systems. Those defenses are necessary. The problem is you never get to the end of your firewall modernization project. You never finish rolling out the latest version of antivirus. The projects never end. And by focusing all that effort on the perimeter and the endpoints, it means you're not focusing on the data center. The attackers, on the other hand, are focusing all their efforts on the data center. Yes, they have to penetrate the perimeter to get there, but it's not that hard to penetrate the perimeter these days. SQL injection, I mentioned that already. It's an easy way for attackers to find a hole in the web application and start talking direct to databases. Spear phishing and malware, drive-by downloads, infecting one of your employees' machines with some kind of malware that gives an attacker a foothold on the network to bypass those perimeter defenses and go straight at the data center. The advanced persistent threat with the zero-day vulnerabilities that are going to take just about anybody down. And then the insider attacks, the insider mistakes, even the social engineering threat that causes somebody with access to either abuse that access or give that access up to an outsider, again, bypassing the perimeter and the endpoints and giving an attacker a direct path to the database. We've really got to change our thinking around information security to protect the assets that the attackers want to steal if we're really going to change our success in protecting our assets. Let's go back to data breach costs for a moment. Data breach costs are on the rise. There's been over 500 million records that have been compromised out of databases since 2008. Gigantic numbers over the last few years. Now, I mentioned Ponemon Research. They do a study every year. It's called the Cost of a Data Breach Study. In 2010, and this is the latest data we have, the cost was between $214 and $318 a record. $214 was the overall average. When any kind of criminal activity was involved, the cost shot up to $318 a record. So if you're an organization that loses 1 million records, and that's not a big data breach these days, $318 a record means the total cost of your business is $318 million, and that's a small data breach. We're talking about some very high costs, again, costs that are rising year after year. Annual losses as the result of data theft are valued at over $388 billion, and the average cost of a data breach is $7.2 million. Now keep in mind, $7.2 million, that includes every tiny data breach that exists, as well as the big, gigantic Sony PlayStation Network style breaches. The reality is our databases are full of holes. Our database security researchers, Team Shatter, as well as others in the industry, continue to find high-risk vulnerabilities for the database vendors to patch. It doesn't feel like the stream of vulnerabilities is slowing down at all. As we continue our efforts to look for them, we continue to find a large number, sometimes very scary vulnerabilities. At the same time, the frequency with which exploit scripts are posted on the web the same day the database vendors release patches is increasing. So attackers have put in their hands right away as these vulnerabilities are patched, the tools to go exploit these vulnerabilities. Fully patched but misconfigured databases are another easy target. So there are definitely folks that fully patch the databases, particularly those new databases you're just bringing up on the network. But if those databases aren't properly configured for security, it's going to be very easy for an attacker to break into those systems, take your data out of those systems. There's just so many configuration options in the database that can leave that database vulnerable if you're not paying very close attention. And I alluded to this earlier, but most database attacks, they bypass your traditional network and host defenses, including your intrusion prevention systems. Database attacks are very specialized, and those traditional network and host intrusion prevention detection systems don't tend to have enough of an understanding about how the database works and should work in order to identify attacks. So when you start to add this stuff together, we've got publicly available exploit code that gets posted almost immediately after vulnerabilities are patched. Combine that with the slow patch cycle that we see out there in the market. Most organizations take 6 to 9 months to patch a production database. That leads to some incredibly high-risk DBMS exposures. So continuing along these lines, our team Shatter, our security research team, they've gone out and they've looked and culled together the top 10 database vulnerabilities and misconfigurations that folks should be worried about. We've sort of taken a page out of the OWASP, the top 10 book here. We like that methodology a lot. And we've constructed a top 10 for databases. So let's spend a little time walking through the database top 10. First one, DB number 1, default and weak passwords. Every database you install comes with some default accounts that are installed with the database. But it's not only the database that installs default accounts. Applications, when you install them, will install default accounts too. Now the problem with these default accounts is they have well-known passwords. So we've got lists published on the internet that list out every version of every database, the default accounts, and the default passwords that are associated with those accounts. You've got the same thing for applications. It's very easy for someone to get their hands on a list of known default database usernames and passwords that they can simply use to try to break into a database. At the same time, everyone who gets a database login gets a password. And if folks aren't setting good passwords, just like everywhere else in the world, those passwords can be cracked. The thing with databases is that there's an awful lot of tools out there that make it easy for an attacker to break the database passwords. So you've got to be very careful about that, particularly since most organizations are not actively monitoring database login activity. So somebody may be running a password cracker against your database, and if you're not very carefully watching for lots of failed logins, you may have no idea that that's going on. Just to give you some examples of default accounts in databases, Oracle ships with quite a few of them. Oracle's got the account system with the password manager. That's a DBA level account in the database. The account sys is the most powerful account in Oracle. It's got the password change on install. Now, when you install a new Oracle database, you always log in with sys as the first thing that you do. You type that password in, change on install, and you'd think most folks would change that password right then and there. It's shocking how many production Oracle databases I've been able to connect to with the username sys and the password change on install. Another Oracle account, the user Scott with the password Tiger. Scott was one of Oracle's developers. Tiger was his cat's name. That's a sample account that ships with Oracle. It's one of those really well-known defaults that we find in so many production, development, and test systems. There's rarely a need to have the Scott account on or that schema associated with it on your Oracle database. there for training purposes. That surface area, those opportunities for someone to attack, really need to cut them down. And it's not an Oracle-only problem. MySQL, the user root with a blank password, the user admin with the password admin, SQL Server and Sybase both have an account called SA for System Administrator. The most powerful account in the database has a blank password by default. With SQL Server, well, when you install Microsoft SQL Server, you actually have to check a box to keep that blank SA password in place. Otherwise, they want you to type one in. It's not that uncommon for folks to check the box during the install process and leave the SA password blank. IBM DB2 doesn't even have its own authentication mechanism. It relies on OS authentication, but that doesn't mean it's not going to create new OS users when you install the database, which are also going to have default passwords that could be used to access DB2. You've got to be aware of DB2, even though it doesn't carry internal authentication. One of my favorites, username set to the same as the password. Now this is sort of an approach that's been made popular by Oracle. Most of Oracle's default accounts ship with the username set the same as the password. Oracle ships about 30 to 35 default accounts with each version of the database. DBSNMP is a favorite of mine because I see DBSNMP with the password DBSNMP on almost every Oracle database I look at throughout my career. DBSNMP, I always thought DBSNMP was about managing Oracle Enterprise Manager and the intelligent agent on the database. But it turns out DBSNMP means something very different entirely. DBSNMP, in fact, stands for Database Security, Not My Problem. Unfortunately, this is the perspective that far too many people who manage databases feel, that database security is somebody else's problem. Let's move on to the next one, DB number 2, SQL injection in the database. Now, we talk about SQL injection all the time, but we talk about it as a web application vulnerability, something that allows attackers to take advantage of our internet-facing applications and gain direct access to our databases. The thing is, SQL injection can exist inside the database as well. So functions and stored procedures inside a database may also be vulnerable to SQL injection. And in fact, a lot of the vulnerabilities we find and report these days are SQL injection vulnerabilities inside the database. A lot of these vulnerabilities are in functions and packages that are executable by public by default, meaning anybody who can get any kind of query inside the database to run, whether that's through SQL injection in a web app or it's through their guest account in the database or their low-privileged account in the database, they can typically exploit these vulnerabilities to gain some significant control. The way these vulnerabilities, these SQL injection vulnerabilities inside the database get fixed is typically by patching the database itself. So the vendor patch is required, and again, that means the 6 to 9 month, maybe more patch cycle before these things can be fixed. The problem with that is freely available exploit code. So if you go out and you look at the vendor patches that are coming out from the database vendors and just Google the name of the vulnerability they patched and the word exploit, almost 100% of the time, if you click the first link, and this is a random Oracle 11 exploit that I typed in, you'll be able to connect right on the first link from Google to exploit code. And you'll see right here I've got some exploit code. I'm able to just take this code, cut and paste right into my database query tool, whatever I'm using. Maybe it's, again, into a input box on a web application that I've figured out how to inject SQL into. But here you go. I just use Google, and I quickly find the exploit code that lets me do things like grant myself DBA rights or execute Java commands or do whatever I want, really, in the database. DB number 3, excessive user and group permissions. So the theory of least privilege is great in theory, but it's hard in practice. The truth is entitlements are very hard to manage, and there's a lot of reasons for that. But for the technical perspective, the entitlement management system, the access control system in a database is very complicated. Databases have a comprehensive role-based access control system that allows you to grant privileges to users, that allows you to grant privileges to roles, that allows you to make roles members of roles that are members of roles, and get into these complex recursive relationships. databases grant a lot of privilege by default, and there's a lot of implied privileges that are granted in the database that you really need to understand what the privilege means in order to understand what access that grants the user that's been given that privilege. And sometimes those things are very hard to figure out. So from a technical perspective, it's really hard to manage entitlements. From a business perspective, we have another challenge. Studies have shown that users in an organization almost never lose any privileges. Throughout their tenure in the organization, they always gain privileges. So the longer folks have been around, it tends to be the more privileges that they have in the systems. So as folks move to a new job, as they get promoted, as they take over somebody's responsibility for a week when that person's on vacation, they gain privileges in systems, but they almost never lose the privileges they don't need anymore. So we've got a number of issues that sort of come together, technical challenges combined with sort of business realities that really create sort of a perfect storm around excessive user privileges to your sensitive data. So let me just give you an example of what it looks like in the database. At Application Security, we produce some software we call rights management and user entitlement review that's part of our DB Protect and App Protective offerings that help our customers actually look at and figure out who's got access to what data. So this is a report from our software that's just showing some of the privileges that users have and how they got those privileges. So here's an example. We're looking at a privilege called execute on sys.dbmshs. The user that's granted to here is gtrog. That's granted to gtrog through a role called scan services, which is granted to scan services through a role called DBA, which is granted to DBA through a role called OLAP DBA. So on and so forth. I get 6 roles deep here before I eventually figure out how gtrog got this execute privilege. I had to look all the way down until I found the HS admin role, until I finally found that specific privilege granted. These paths can get very, very long and complex, and this is not an unusual example. Privileges can really bite you if you've just given folks access to data they shouldn't have, well, you've just given them the keys to the kingdom. Duty number 4, unnecessary enabled DBMS features. It's all about minimizing the attack surface. So you really want to limit what attackers have to use against you as much as you can. And the way you do that is by disabling all the features in the database system that you're not using. And that does take some research and some understanding. Database vendors have worked hard to pack their databases chock full of every kind of feature you could want, and then stuck them all in there by default, so it's very easy for you to get access. Those powerful features are great if you're building an application that's going to calculate directions from one point to another. Oracle spatial features are amazing. They're going to help you build your application. If you're not doing that, you probably don't need those spatial features involved. And I'll just throw out one random example, but every database has got them. Databases ship with Java features. They ship with XMLDB. They ship with access to run operating system commands, to call OS-level DLLs. All this stuff can allow you to build some very comprehensive functionality around your database, which is very cool. But it can also give an attacker the ability to steal your data and tear your organization to shreds. So it's really important that if you're not using these features, you figure that out and turn them off. And that way, when Microsoft or Sybase or IBM or Oracle comes out with a patch for their Java subsystem to patch a horrible vulnerability, if you're not using Java and you've removed the Java subsystem, you've got nothing to worry about. And that's a good place to be. So let me give you some examples of features that I see enabled on databases all over the place that really increase the attack surface and are often unused. So I mentioned the Java subsystem. I also mentioned the UTL packages in Oracle. UTL files, one of the more important ones. Oracle ships with a bunch of utility packages, UTL packages, that are part of the database by default, and they have privileges granted to run them to public, or everybody in the database by default. So every user in the database can typically run these packages. The UTL file allows you to read and write operating system files through the database. So you can basically open up and read, or open up and write, any files potentially on the server. Now, there are some settings in Oracle that can control which directories you can view and which ones you can't, but typically if folks are leaving UTL file access granted to public, they're not doing the more complex security things to limit what UTL file can do. In any case, there's an opportunity for an attacker who gets on the database to start controlling your file system. You think about it, they could open a .rhosts file and create a remote login for themselves. They could open an auto-exec bat file on Windows and do anything they want in the next boot-up process. They can access data files or other files directly. There's some real scariness that you can do when you can read and write any operating system file through the database. In Sybase and in SQL Server, there's a function called XP Command Shell. You'll notice a lot of similarities between Sybase and SQL Server. Microsoft bought Sybase for Windows years ago and morphed that into SQL Server, so you'll see there's some common roots there. Anyway, XP Command Shell is a database function that allows users to run operating system commands, just like they're right there at the command line, through the database. If somebody can just run operating system commands through the database, they effectively own the operating system, particularly since the databases almost always run as OS administrator level users. A number of other examples here. In SQL Server, we've got the OLADB ad hoc query, the Open Rosette and Open Data Source packages. That stuff allows you to remotely connect to and query merge data from multiple databases with one another. Very cool if you need to add data up from different sources to pull together one report or one bit of analysis. Very cool if you're an attacker that's managed to get onto one low security, not that important development system that's got the OLADB ad hoc query system enabled, and then leverage that to connect to other much more valuable, potentially production servers in the environment. IBM's got a privilege called Create Not Fenced. That allows logins to create stored procedures. That's often the first step in a privilege escalation attack, is a user creating a stored procedure that grants them very high privilege in the database. Now, if you can create a procedure, you can type it in. You may not be able to run that procedure and have it grant you those privileges, but if you can trick a high-privileged user into running your procedure, then that high-privileged user may inadvertently give you their privileges. We see a lot of attacks coming together this way, and this is just another one of those ways that the attack surface can be minimized or increased depending on the way you set up the database. DB number 5, broken configuration management. When you look at a database and the number of options for configuring that database, you quickly hit the point of configuration option overload. I mean, from the beginning, it's not too bad. You name the instance, you choose the data storage locations, you set up the disk information, the database gets up and running. But then you move into the advanced feature set, the add-on modules, the security settings, and quickly you're in an enormous quagmire of settings that are sometimes conflicting, often confusing, generally set to unsecure by default to make it easier for you to use the database, but just all leave avenues open for attack. Just asking the question, what's the right configuration for the database, is an awfully hard question to ask. In fact, just answering the question of what's our current database configuration can be a very hard question to ask. So where should you go with it? What do you do with database configuration? It's really important that you get this right. There's some great resources out there from folks like the Department of Defense and the Defense Information Systems Agency. DISA publishes the DISA STIG that'll give you specific guidance on how to set up a database. CIS, or the Center for Internet Security, will give you a benchmark with specific guidance on how to set up the configuration of the database. You need to know what you're aiming for before you can actually get there and call your database configuration secure. So start with an open, publicly available checklist. Use one of the built-in checklists in our products, or tap your subject matter experts, but get that figured out. Here's some potential misconfigurations we'll see in the database. Oracle Configuration Management stores all sorts of configuration data about host names, usernames, data file locations, way too much information to give an attacker. Sybase sys audit table, if it's not properly configured, audit records can be just lost. SQL Server default ports. SQL Server almost always runs on port 1433 with a listener or a redirector on port 1434. Those are well-known ports. It's very easy for people to find those databases. If they're sitting on those well-known ports, why not run them on non-default ports? IBM's got a configuration parameter that'll make your head spin. It's called Trust All Clients. And if you set it to yes, which in some cases is the default setting, any client that attempts to connect to the database is considered trusted. It basically turns off authentication in the database. Not a good thing. DB number 6, buffer overflows. Buffer overflows, we start to get into some more advanced and more sophisticated attack techniques. Buffer overflows, in the simplest sense, can crash your database or your database servers. But with some more advanced techniques and with a more skilled attacker or with a packaged exploit, buffer overflows can be used to load and run arbitrary code on your database servers within the context of the database. Buffer overflow issues in the database come from the database vendors, so they're actually part of the vendor code. Only a vendor patch is going to fix the issue. Just like a SQL injection vulnerability, right? You need to apply that patch to your environment before you're fully protected, and often the time it takes to patch is 6 months or more. Let me just show you a database exploit demo here. I'm going to give you a quick look at what an actual database attack looks like. Now, I'm going to use an overflow attack here, and I'm going to use it in a simple way just to crash the database server. So what I've got here is I've got IBM DB2, DB2 version 9.1, and I'm running on Windows, and I've made a connection to DB2 with a user called user1. Now, this user1, has no privileges in the database beyond the ability to log in. So this is the lowest privileged user you can create in a DB2 distributed database. I don't really need any privileges beyond the login, though, to execute this very simple attack. So let me show it to you. Here's my attack. It's just this one line of SQL code. Select, repeat, and then we're going to make a recursive call to repeat. And you see we pass the parameter 1 and then 1,000, so that inner call to repeat repeats the number 1 1,000 times. The outer call to repeat will take those 1,000 ones and repeat them. Wow, that's a really big number. 107,374,1825. There's a lot of digits in that number. It's going to repeat it an awful lot of times. So once this big select statement kind of gets run, it's going to overflow heap memory to this DB2 database. That's all it takes. I just run the exploit. I don't need any special privileges. Repeat is just a built-in primitive in the database, and there's no privileges that control access to the repeat function. So I just run this one line of SQL. I hit enter. Now I've done this with a direct database connection. I could do exactly the same thing with SQL injection through a web application. When I go and I look at the event viewer on this server that the database is running on, what I see here is the DB2 service is terminated unexpectedly. You see it says DB2 copy 1. What's happened here is the database has crashed. I have no more DB2 database running now. The service has crashed because I overwrote heap memory with lots and lots and lots of ones, eventually overwriting things like stack pointers, and managed to send the database off into nowhere land and crash. Very, very simple buffer overflow or heap overflow here that allows me to crash the database server. Now, if this database is running your online business, and it happens to be a few days before Christmas and you're processing transactions, this is about the last thing in the world you want to have happen, but it's truly this easy if you're not patched and you're not paying attention. And by the way, there's no secret sauce here, right? DB2 repeat overflow, type it into Google, click the first link, and you're going to see exactly the same exploit code that I just ran against my system. This exploit code was available just about the same minute as the patch became available for the DB2 databases. Cut and paste, all it takes. DB number 7, privilege escalation. Becoming the DBA or any other privileged user. These vulnerabilities can lead any low-privileged user to become the DBA or to get access to data they shouldn't have access to. Now, these privilege escalation vulnerabilities come about through different avenues, but in almost every case, it's a vendor patch kind of issue where you've got to wait for Sybase or IBM or Oracle or whoever to issue a patch to fix the problem, and then you've got to wait for your team to fully validate that patch before they can roll out the fix. In the meantime, your systems may be exposed to privilege escalation. And once again, it's not hard to find the exploits. So here is a vulnerability in Oracle that's a privilege escalation weakness in a package called reset in prog index on the MDSys schema. I just typed mdsys.resetinprog.index exploit into Google. I got that out of the Oracle patch update. Click the first link, and you can see right here that I've got exploit code, that I can simply cut and paste, and I can use this exploit code. In this case, it's showing me how to grant the user Scott DBA level access. DB number 8, denial of service. Everybody remember the SQL Slammer worm? It was a long time ago, right? It feels like it was forever ago. When that SQL Slammer worm hit, there were 75,000 systems that got taken down in the first 10 minutes of the attack. Some of those systems were pretty notable. I remember when the Bank of America ATM network went down as a result of the attack. And I was left with no cash and frustrated, and I know a lot of other people were in the same situation. The thing that was really crazy about the Slammer worm, beyond the massive scope, beyond the fact that it went on for years, was the fact that Microsoft had patched SQL Server 6 months before Slammer worm hit. 6 months we had to fix our database servers before an attacker actually managed to wrap their hands around an exploit and push it out there en masse. 6 months. But we still had 75,000 victims in the first 10 minutes. Just drives home the point that patch management for DBMS is critical. And I don't think our situation today is far better than it was when the Slammer worm hit. What's better is that we don't have as many vulnerabilities that were so easy to exploit as Slammer worm turned out to be. But we do have just as many unpatched databases out there just waiting for somebody to put the time and effort into creating the next big database war. DB number 9, unpatched databases. Vulnerable the day of the patch is released, right? The exploit code or the proof of concept code emerges almost right away. And now you've got a situation of not only, oh my God, I've got a patch to roll out, but I've got to roll it out to systems in order. You can't patch everything at the same time, at least unless you can roll everything back at the same time. So you often have a big testing process, and you've got to determine which are the critical business systems that you're going to patch first, and how you're going to roll out those patches so that you get the most critical data protected the most quickly. DB number 10, unencrypted data, both at rest and in motion. So data at rest, sitting on your disk, just waiting for that disk to be backed up and then the backup to fall off the truck that it was loaded up onto. There's a lot of options you have here. File system encryption can encrypt the file and the data sitting right there on the disk. Transparent data encryption from Oracle or some of the other built-in encryption features that databases offer can encrypt the data even inside the database, at least to protect it from some users. You can actually get a ton of information about data encryption on our teamshatter.com site. So you get a couple of links here that you might want to click on if you're researching database encryption solutions. But it's not just encrypting the data on the disk. You've also got the data as it flows across the network. And it's actually pretty easy to encrypt the data as it flows across the network. The databases all have features like SSL that allow you to turn on robust and simple network encryption that will keep an eavesdropper from stealing your data without impacting the performance and reliability of your database system. So there's 10 database vulnerabilities and misconfigurations you really ought to be thinking about, you ought to be concerned about and dealing with. But I like to go to 11. DB number 11, not doing anything. Not doing anything. Relying on perimeter protections only, it just doesn't work. We've seen breach after breach after breach that's proven it. Please don't rely on perimeter protections only. You just have to look at the news over the last couple of months to get a list of major corporations who've decided to focus their security efforts on the perimeter and have paid the price. Also, define who's responsible for database security. Who are the stakeholders? Are the DBAs responsible? Are the security team responsible? Is there some shared responsibility? Who's going to decide what it means to have a secure database, and who's going to actually implement that and enforce it? You've got to make those decisions and make that policy and procedure very clear to your employees if you're going to have a functional and successful database security program. Don't get caught in the trap of lack of communication between security and DBA teams. Don't let that issue leave your databases exposed to attackers and to theft. So some database security tips for 2012. Devise a database security plan. Understand what you're going to do, who's responsible for doing it, and who's going to make sure it got done properly. Locate all your sensitive information. So get an inventory of all the databases running on your network, and then within that set of databases, get an inventory for where all your sensitive information is stored. Minimize your attack surface. So turn off all those unnecessary database features that you're not using. Go out and do a rigorous check for passwords. Fix all the default passwords that you've got in your database. Eliminate any blank or weak passwords and replace them with strong passwords. Make sure you're regularly patching your databases. If that means figuring out how to roll patches back quickly, maybe that's the best approach, because often the testing approach just leaves you vulnerable and exposed for too long. There are some patch management tools for databases that are on the market now. There's some pretty good ones from both BMC and HP. You might want to check those out to help speed along your database patching process. Implement least privilege. Understand who your privileged users are, what their privileges are, figure out what people need for their jobs, and try to restrict privileges to the bare minimum. Encrypt your data, both at rest and while it flows across your network. And then make sure you train and retrain your employees on corporate security best practices. It's often awareness issues, simple mistakes that lead to big security breaches. So make sure you remind everybody, even your security team, of security best practices on a regular basis. Some tips to help you along in your database security plan. Start with an established checklist. I mentioned the DISA-STIG. It's a great place to start. They publish guidance on SQL Server and Oracle, as well as some generic guidance you can use for any other database. Customize it to meet your own needs. You may have other industry regulations to follow, like PCI or Sarbanes-Oxley. You can definitely work these programs together to get one database security plan that you can roll out across all your databases. And make sure you roll it out, by the way, in a thoughtful way. Don't try to boil the ocean. Pick your highest priority issues and remediate them first on your most critical systems. And then sort of layer on checks and tests, as well as less critical systems as you move through the process. Make sure you're understanding the databases that have sensitive data in them. So really rigorously check the data in those databases. Secure the ones with sensitive data first. Minimize that attack surface to turn off features that you're just not using. Talk quite a bit about passwords. External authentication systems can be a great option for your databases. They tend to have much better auditing and much better password controls than the database systems have for you. So you may want to turn to some external authentication, some kind of identity management system to help eliminate the password problem in databases. Regularly patch those databases. So again, the database vendors are putting out some pretty important security patches. They're fixing some horrifying vulnerabilities. Do your best to get on top of those patches as soon as you can. Understand the risk of the vulnerabilities, and then put together a balancing act between the risk of breaking your database by installing a patch or breaking your app, and the risk of being hacked through one of these vulnerabilities that you're exposed to. One thing you can do to really mitigate the risk is database activity monitoring and database intrusion prevention. If you start watching access to your database in a real-time and consistent way with a database activity monitoring solution, You can actually identify attempts to exploit known vulnerabilities, attempts to take advantage of weak configuration settings during the period of time that you're going through your testing. So if it takes you 6 months to roll out a patch, use monitoring for those 6 months while you're exposed to make sure that nobody's actually trying to or successfully exploiting those known vulnerabilities you've got in your system. To implement least privileges, you've got to untangle the web of user entitlements. You've got to understand what privileges users have and what privileges they should have, and then you've got to just map those privileges right to their job functions. Do your best not to assign any new privileges to guest accounts or to public in the database. The database vendors put a ton of privileges in the public bucket to begin with. That's already hard to manage. Don't make it any worse by adding any more. Talked about encryption. Don't store sensitive data in the clear text in a database. So if you're storing sensitive data in your database, it's got to be encrypted. We saw a breach on Christmas of a company called Stratfor, which is a security intelligence company. Stratfor was storing credit card numbers for all of their customers in their database, and they didn't encrypt those credit card numbers. So Anonymous was able to break into their database, steal the credit card numbers, and then charge over $500,000 worth of donations to various charities using the credit card numbers that they stole from Stratfor's database. That's just stupid. We can't be leaving our database sensitive data in the clear. The attackers came right out and hit them hard about it and talked about how clueless that organization was about database security. Don't be clueless about database security. Take these steps and make sure that you've done the right thing to protect your data. Encrypt the most sensitive data that's sitting in your systems. It's a last line of defense, so you want to take the other steps first, but it's one that you can't forget. And then security best practices. Make sure everyone's aware of your rules and regulations for information security. Regularly run a training program. And make sure that beyond the training, you're also doing things like penetration tests, security audits against your sensitive and critical systems. So use technology to complement your education process so that your employees are aware of security issues and they're dealing with them, they're cognizant, and so that your systems are as protected and as locked down as they can be with the latest and greatest technology to protect them. The attackers are using the latest and greatest technology to come after you. You've got to be able to put the right weapons in your own hands to defend yourselves. So that wraps it up. That rounds up my discussion. I'm going to open up the questions panel and see if we've got any questions, but I sure do appreciate your participation today. So we've got a question about a globally accepted benchmark for Sybase IQ. Sybase IQ is Sybase's data warehouse platform. It's not something that I've seen anyone take a stab at writing a global benchmark for. There's just not that many Sybase IQ systems being used out there compared to something like Sybase ASE that folks have spent a lot of time. Now that being said, you can take a generic checklist like the generic DISA-STIG, which talks about best practices for databases, and you can use that to try to build a framework for Sybase IQ, but it'll definitely take some work for you to get there. Where you will find, of course, benchmarks is for Oracle, for SQL Server, and even for IBM DB2 that are out there. Sybase as well, published by CIS and by DISA. So we've got a number of questions about the slides being available for download. We definitely will make the slides available for download. Everybody who registered for this session will get an email, and we'll send you the download links as well. Another question that's come in here. What are your thoughts on client groups, such as the Department of Defense, which require DBMSs to be set to operate on a default standard port versus a non-default port? This sometimes become a point of contention during the CNA process. So this is This is an interesting thing here for organizations to require that databases operate on a default port, whereas the audit process and maybe the security guidance requires the databases to operate on a non-default port. This is not an issue that I'd get too stuck in the mud about. Putting your database on a non-default port definitely makes it a little harder to find, but if somebody's looking for that database, they're going to find it anyway. You don't get appreciable security by putting your database on a non-default port, at least not from somebody that's looking at it. So I wouldn't get too hung up on that issue, and I would try hard not to let it become a problem in certification and accreditation, because it's truly not going to make a material difference in the security of the system. It's a matter of making it a little easier for an attacker to find your database. But once again, it's easy enough to find those databases on non-default ports. We've got a question about our product roadmap and whether we'll be expanding our capabilities to address open source DBMSs in the future. It's a good question, and we actually we do have a strategy around open source systems. We've been scanning and protecting MySQL databases for quite some time. This question specifically asked me about Postgres. We do continue to discuss and look at Postgres. Postgres databases are most definitely in our future. Protecting them, particularly as the popularity of Postgres grows, while we see the popularity of MySQL waning as a result, it seems as a result of their acquisition by Oracle. So we do continue to look very closely and carefully at Postgres. Our experts are up to speed on that database platform. And if folks have specific needs or requirements around Postgres, and you've got a relationship with us, I encourage you to contact your sales rep and chat with them about it, and our technical team would certainly be in touch to get some information from you about what you're doing and what you're using, so we make sure that as we roll that functionality out, cover our requirements. Got another question about security granularity around packaged software or lack thereof. Well, Jeff here is asking about, isn't the real problem from an insider and social engineering perspective, and how can this be fixed unless folks like SAP and Oracle and the other app vendors fix it? There's definitely some issues around applications in addition to the database. So each of these applications, of course, needs a database to run, and these databases need applications to have a reason to exist. And there are not so many comprehensive tools around application-level security. So who's doing what in the app? Is somebody trying to break into your app? Are your apps vulnerable or configured properly? And we recognize there really is a lack of tools to protect that software, and some very obvious proof that those applications have just as many vulnerabilities in them, if not more, than databases and some of the other technologies we have put time into. So yeah, that does make the problem significantly bigger, and particularly from an insider and social engineering perspective, folks getting access to those apps and then exfiltrating data through the apps is a big risk. So the best way to fix it, Jeff, you're right, is certainly to have Oracle and SAP and the app vendors step up and do a better job, but I think we all know that's unrealistic, at least in the short term. So what we've got to do is try to use the technology we have around to do our best to shore up our defenses. We actually help a lot of our clients do a better job at securing their apps straight through the database. So by locking down the way the app uses the database, by understanding the usage of that app and database combination and looking for anomalies, we can often help folks really improve the security of their applications. At the same time, we're trying to look for solutions that will help us bring security to the front end of applications, and we've got some pretty cool ideas there. Going through the questions. The question about whether we had more breaches this year because more organizations were public about those breaches. I don't think that's the case. In fact, we didn't have the most data breaches this year than we've ever had. We've had a larger number in the past. We've just had a lot more records stolen this year than we have in the past. So the data breaches were more successful, or there were a lot more very large successful data breaches in 11 than we saw in years past. Is public disclosure a big part of that? It's probably a small part of it. Certainly there's more rules around disclosure, but we've got hacktivists that are doing the disclosure for us for the most part. So a lot of the breaches we saw disclosed by the hacktivists rather than by the breached organizations. And in addition to that, we've seen a lot of breaches and disclosures in places where they don't have breach disclosure laws. So in the last few months, we've seen a whole boatload of major data breaches in China with gaming and social media companies. There's no data breach notification rules in China whatsoever, yet these folks have come out and talked about it. I don't think this data breach, this understanding of data breaches is really being driven by more people being public about it. I think it's just being driven by a lot more data breaches actually going on and being successful. So I'm looking at the clock, and I realize that we're out of time here. I want to thank everybody one more time for your participation today, and for all the great questions that came in. Again, we'll make this recording available. We'll send you a link, and any questions that I didn't get the opportunity to get to, we will do our best to get back to you folks directly by email. Thanks so much, and we're looking forward to hearing from you on another webinar again in the future.